Hi, Nathan. Hello, Akash again.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
I'm just waiting to share my screen. Okay, I found the green button. I think this is it, basic. Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. We'll just give it maybe 2 more minutes to see if there will be more people joining. It is no meeting week for Microsoft, so you are not obligated to join this meeting. Adding to the agenda. Action. Nathan, is there anything that you would like to discuss?
Yeah, no, not today.
Sure. Okay, I think we can get started. The first item on the actionable PRs, I have a PR to update the CSI driver key vault configuration from pod identity to workload identity. Akash, would you be able to take a look at that? I tried out in the script where I set the service account name, but it didn't seem to do anything for me. So I think when Eric comes back, I can validate again. Like all I validated is by populating those fields, it didn't affect anything and the scenario continued to work.
Okay. And
so, yeah,
does it
go
work
ahead.
with the auth provider stuff? It probably still does, right? Because it's workload identity.
Yeah. The advantage of having the AK Azure Key Vault provider to use workload identity so that the customer can just configure workload identity instead of configuring both pod identity and workload identity. So now you can configure workload identity and have Key Vault pull the certificate or have the provider pull from the Azure Key Vault to load the certificate as well as authenticating to your Azure container registry to get the artifacts.
Yep, that's really cool. Yeah, now it's all under one umbrella, which should make it a lot easier for someone to use. So, yep, I'll take a look at it and leave any feedback if I have any. But
yeah, thanks. So, okay, Jimmy is here. Admit. Yeah, so basically, I want to populate the service account if Key Vault is enabled or Azure Workload Identity is enabled.
Yep.
That's pretty much the change.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, okay. Next item is, I'm just going through by the pull request ID. So the next item is update policy provider.
Yep. So I have a PR out now based off of kind of what we were talking about last week. So it does a few things. So it makes the policy provider into a plugin. So it adds all of the scaffolding needed, including the factory and some of the config changes. It also updates the current config policy provider to adhere to the plugin model. And it adds a method to the policy provider API called the overall verify success. We were talking about that last week as well. And I left the whole any versus all policy distinction because I don't think we came to a clear conclusion last week whether we should just remove it. So right now the logic implements both, and I added some testing also to make sure, unit tests to make sure it all works. Yeah, so thanks Susan for your first round review, and yeah, I'll address some of the comments and then get another round as well.
Yeah, I had a question, Akash, for how would we share the same configuration for cosign and notary, given that any means that we require at least one notary signature. So if I were to pull a cosign signature with the current behavior, would that fail?
Yeah, and it would fail by design because you are specifying that you want at least one notary signature to have existed and to have verified to true for the full verification to continue. If you don't want that to be the case, then you can either change the policy to be for cosign specifically, or you can just remove it entirely.
Yeah, does that mean we will have, like the user will have to update the configuration dynamically?
Yes, so that was kind of what we were talking about. Like the reason maybe having like an OPA provider would be better, because then the user would specify the policy through OPA templates, a Rego template, rather than them having to fiddle with our configuration, which currently requires you to restart the pod if you do.
So just so I'm clear on that, because I had a conversation with AWS folks today, and so when you say restart the pod to make changes, you're talking about making changes to both the trust store and the trust policy?
Yeah, so if you make any change to the trust policy or to the store, as in the configuration for the referrer store, you would need to restart the pod because we don't support any sort of dynamic configuration.
So under the covers, sorry, I don't mean to go into a little weeds here, but I want to understand it. So under the covers here, Ratify is going to reach out to the notation client. And if I want to change the notation client trust store or the trust policy, I can do so. But in so doing, I got to bounce the Ratify pod or collection thereof. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Trying to understand that. And I have some questions about this as well later, maybe if we have some time towards the end of the meeting.
Sure. Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Jimmy, is your question related to the policy plugin?
Well, so no, not necessarily. It's related to what I discovered today about how the AWS side is going to work. And so I'm trying to figure out how it's going to interface with Ratify. And so, yeah, I don't necessarily think it's focused specifically on this plugin, though I probably need to learn more about it anyways. So
I see. Yeah, we don't have a long agenda today. Feel free to ask after the PRs. So basically on the screen, this is the updated configuration. Now we've refactored the policy plugin from the executor to its own interface. Just trying to get some feedback on the name, because we are using configuration and policy pretty much everywhere. Is there like a name? Is there a better name that anyone can suggest for the kind of like the default policy?
what is it used for? I mean, what's the significance of the name?
Oh, it's the name itself is just used to register the actual provider. I think what Susan is getting at, that is it a little confusing, the name, calling it config policy. Is there a better name that we can use instead? So
is this the policy that I guess indicates the scope of the trust stores to be used, or is this a different policy?
Yeah, so no, so this is the policy that determines what what types of signatures or artifacts need to exist or evaluate to true. So the whole any versus all. And it also includes the overall, after we've verified a bunch of different artifacts, what should be the final like answer that we return based off of the policy specified.
Okay, this is sort of related to the any all conversation we had last week.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So Susan, it is the reason it's called config policy before, and I think it's just because this provider is it's specifying the policies inside the configuration itself versus having it specified like by a policy engine or like another policy template. That's why I guess it's called config policy, but I don't know what other name would be better.
Sure. Yeah, if I were to name it, I probably would, yeah, it would be the policy inside the configuration. Like that is the meaning behind it, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the meaning. Yeah.
And so this is like a sample implementation of a set of policy and how to enforce it. Is that correct, Akash?
Yeah, so this is like a sample, exactly. This whole file is basically a sample JSON file that if someone wanted to use, they could. And in the policy plugin portion, it's saying that I want to register, I want to use the config policy provider that is previously registered because we've implemented a config policy provider separately. And then in that, the configuration policy provider has its own fields configuration that it takes in as input, which in this case is the artifact verification policies, and the provider handles basically what that actually means. So, and in this case, the signature that we provide, the notary V2 signature, that's just an example of a type of signature that could be provided in a type of policy. It's just an example. So,
Can I define multiple
yes.
policies, and how would it impact the overall result? Like, let's say if I had another one defined for, say, cosine artifacts.
Yep. So you would, let's say you added another map entry, which would be application / whatever io.cosine.signature, and you said any next to it. So now you have two entries basically. So what that means is that.
Oh, I was actually thinking if I defined another plug, is this an array?
So
Or
no.
can you only have one?
Yeah, you can only have one. Yeah.
Got it. So if I was verifying two different images, one have a cosine signature, one with a notary signature, I have to modify the policy because one policy would only kind of work for, if I only have the notary signature on image A, if I have a cosine signature on image B, the only way is to update the policy plugin. Maybe restart is required.
Yes, if you want to enforce that the cosine signature has to exist and evaluate to true. In its current form, if you had a cosine signature, it would get evaluated, but it wouldn't factor in the overall decision of that the Ratify would return, because there's no enforceable policy defined saying, hey, you need to have the cosine signature there, or you need all of the cosine signatures to evaluate to true if you used all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm starting to think like if we have this use case, then it'll make sense to pass this policy at validation time. When you say, I want to validate this image A, by the way, here's the policy.
Yeah, so I'm
because
trying
it kind of maps to the validation that I'm performing.
yeah, I see what you're saying.
But yeah, just a thought. What do you think, Jimmy, on the behavior that we can? Because by saying notary any, we're saying at least one notary signature must exist on the artifact.
So one signature exists, and I'm trying to get my mind around it. This is kind of downstream from the configured trust stores and trust policy, right? So if the trust policy is set such that the scope would use a specific trust store, and within that trust store there are multiple I would assume multiple certs or multiple keys. And I apologize for not knowing exactly what I'm talking about here, but I'm still trying to get my mind around all of this. So if one of those come back as present on that artifact, on that image, let's say, and they are scoped within the trust policy, then I think the any kind of makes sense. Does that make sense to you all? Am I missing something?
I think I think that makes sense. I think so.
Because I mean, the way that I understand the whole trust store, and you know, you're probably going to start out with a root trust store, and then you're going to add trust stores to the configuration of Ratify, and then bounce Ratify, and then the trust policy will say which, for a specific scope, what trust stores make sense, or what trust stores are supposed to be used. So can the policy say that multiple trust stores are or multiple paths within the trust store are available for a specific scope? And if that's, and I don't know if that's true, but if it is true, then any makes sense. If it's not true, I mean, it comes down to what the trust, but to me, it comes down to what the trust policy says. If the trust policy gives you the ability to select multiples that are an or logic instead of an and logic, then any makes sense. Am I missing
Jimmy,
something?
Jimmy, may I add something if I understand correctly? The trust store multiple keys is scoped to a signature. Let's assume I am validating a signature, and to validate that signature, where is my trust store, right? But what my understanding in this policy is, it's not scoped to a signature. It is multiple signatures. If you have multiple signatures to an artifact, is that okay if at least one signature is valid? Now, how do you validate that signature is trusted or not? That's where you go to the trust store, you identify the appropriate key that you have to look up to validate that signature. And if you have multiple keys, now can that signature be considered as valid even if one key, or even at least if one key is successful or not, is specific to the signature validation? But here, I think with respect to the Ratify, if you have multiple signatures to an artifact, is it okay if at least one signature is valid? I think the scope is the
Yeah. So,
point here.
and I think we're kind of, I think we're kind of saying maybe the same thing.
Okay.
My approach was, and it's based on, quite frankly, it's based on my limited knowledge of this. But if the other policy, the trust policy, can indicate that for a given scope, these keys or certs are available, and so when the signatures come back, they are traceable to one of the items in the trust policy scope, then I think any makes sense, as long as it's a valid traceable cert or key that is part of the trust policy scope identified for that specific image URL or fragment thereof.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I think the trust policy would be specific to Notary V2 I'm assuming there will be a policy that is very particular to that verifier, notary V2 verifier.
Absolutely, yeah. And so what I'm saying is, if that trust policy for, let's say, in the case of AWS, for instance, let's say we're going to use notation client with a AWS signer plugin, and we're going to have a scope inside the trust policy. Now, I don't know a lot about the trust policy, but I just assumed that you can have multiple signatures or multiple certs behind signatures, multiple certs that signatures can be based on within a specific single scope. And if that's the case, if the trust policy scope can have multiple keys underpinning the signatures, the different signatures, then one signature coming back that is within the scope of the trust policy hits this policy and that's where the any makes sense. Or you could say they all have to be valid. But I guess what I'm saying is, there is, to me, like last week, I didn't understand it as much as I kind of do this week, I think, which is kind of scary. But if I'm understanding it correctly, then I should be able to choose that if I've got 4 of them that are inside of validly configured within the trust policy scope, and one of the 4 comes back, then if I'm okay with that, then I'm okay with that. And this policy here should reflect that I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I think, yep. I think we are on the same page. Yep.
Does that make, and then I would have to defer to you all about this, because I'm kind of ignorant when it comes to this. I'm still trying to learn.
I'm also in the same boat, Jimmy. I think, I don't know what's happening on the notary V2 side. I'm assuming the trust store, whatever trust store specification that the notary V2 is defining, it allows for multiple cert options or multiple keys for a signature or for multiple signatures. In such case, any makes sense. Yep, if that is the case. Is that accurate, Jimmy? Is that what you're?
So the way that I understand it is, a trust store can be configured, and then you have, let's say you can have multiple trust store names, and within the trust store names, you can have identities. And there are, different certs within those identities.
Yes. Yep.
So now you've got multiple certificates that can create signatures on an artifact inside an ORIS registry. If that's the case, the trust store has that. And so then the scope in the trust policy would say what trust stores can be used or should be used for a specific image URL fragment. And if, and I'm going off of the assumption that that's the case as well, then that means that I could have multiple certs from a trust store feeding signatures, multiple signatures on an image. And if that's the case, then it's a decision for me. Do I want them all, or do I just need one?
Yeah, so in the configuration, currently in this example, we have all. It means all must be valid. But if we specify any, that'll mean the final verification will be true if any of them is valid.
If any of the ones that were derived from the scope in the trust policy are available, if any signatures are available from the scope of the trust policy pointing to those specific trust stores, if that is the case, then any would make sense if that's what I want. I may decide that I want all, and all may be just one cert and one identity and one trust store.
So
No, I did not catch it, Jimmy. Sorry to say that. The point I'm trying to understand, let's take a simple case, any, right? Let's think of any. I have 2 signatures to an artifact. And now I pass a signature to the notary V2 verifier. In order to verify that signature, notary V2 uses the trust store to find the trusted root certs or the cert chains to validate that signature. In that finding, or in that search, if notary V2 finds multiple keys for the same signature, and if any one key is successful, will notary V2 will consider that signature as valid. So you're
So-
saying, yeah, no,
Yeah. So I think what we're saying, so the way that I understand it is one key will be tied to one signature. If Notary V2, based on the trust policy, and what trust stores are scoped for a specific image or URL thereof. And correct me, please, if I'm misunderstanding this, but if multiple trust stores can be scoped to that same image URL or fragment thereof, then you could expect to see multiple signatures from those multiple identities or single identities in multiple trust stores. So that's where I'm getting to this policy here, that if I do have multiple signatures and they come from certs within identities, within trust stores that are all scoped to that same URL for the image, then I just need to make a decision. Do I need all of them, or am I fine with one of them because I know what the trust policy is?
I see.
Am I missing something?
Yeah, the point I think I'm trying to catch here is these multiple signatures that we are trying to validate. Is there any relationship for those signatures, between those signatures? So you're saying there is some relationship in the trust store configured. These multiple signatures tied to the same identity, or something to the key in the trust stores, multiple sources, right?
So yeah, the way that I understand it is that signing the image is out of band from verifying the image. Verifying the image is basically, we're going to send an image URL. I'm assuming we're sending an image URL to the external data provider, which is Ratify in this case. And then Ratify is going to reach down to the notation client. And that's the only intelligence really that we're sending to the notation client through Ratify. We're not telling it what trust store to use. The notation client is going to use
Yes.
the trust stores that are available to it and configured via the trust policy.
Yep.
Right. So if we find a signature or multiple signatures that are based off of the multiple trust stores that are available within the scope of that particular image, then it's just a decision point. Do we need all of them? Like if there's 3 and I bring all 3 back, or I bring one of the 3 back, it really just, to me, if I say any, it should speed things up.
Yep.
I think it's all, I need logically to look at all of them.
I see. Yep. I think that's where I think it is the reason it is configurable is that is contextual. Like if you think all these signatures are related to the trust source that you configured, then you would set it as any, right? So
yeah, I mean,
that's
it's
where
one of
I think
those,
this configuration makes sense. That's
it's
why it
one
is
of-
a configuration that people can change it. Yep.
I think it's one of those use cases where it's almost like one of those multi-principal access use cases, right? Where I've signed this image with multiple, signatures from these multiple identity certs. And this is such a sensitive image that, yes, I want to see all signatures.
Yeah.
But it may not be the case for all images. And that's why I think any and all makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. Makes sense.
Akash, question on the order of execution. Like if we set any here, do we still try to pull all the signatures?
So well, actually, we don't pull all the signatures. We'll get the descriptors for the referrers of the signatures, but if it's any, then we'll like short circuit early. If it's any, if we find something that's true already, we won't bother looking at the other stuff.
So we look at one, then we validate. And if it's satisfied the requirement, we just stop there.
Yeah, if it's any. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we're doing the right thing already.
Yes. I'm almost certain that's what we're doing, but let me confirm on that. So.
Sure, thanks. Teja, this shared on the screen is the updated policy JSON section. Do you I have a question about like, when do we have to think about backward compatibility? So at the moment, previously we're at 1.0.0. Given this change, should we bump up the version? And is it okay to not being backwards compatible because we're still in alpha?
That holds true. Yeah, because it's an alpha, I don't think we'll pay major attention to this versioning.
So we're talking about a major version upgrade then, a major version bump.
Yeah.
Yep.
What's essentially the change here?
Oh, okay. Let me bring up the diff. I think it's this one. So the policy used to look like this. So we just have the artifact verification policy, and then we define what's required, like any and all. And now we've made a policy plugin interface that the plugin have a name, and we have a sample implementation or an implementation that will enforce what's listed in the policy section. Akash, do you want to add to the change?
Yeah, that's basically it. So like implementation wise, it's different, but the logic and the end result is basically the same. Just we've made it into plugins now versus it being a built-in only configuration-based policy provider.
Yeah, it's an alpha version. I don't know. We don't
Yeah.
need to worry much about this. Yeah. And also, I think you just added a section. You added a property, right? It's a policy
Yeah.
plugin is a property. Yeah, I don't worry. At least I wouldn't worry much about that. Yeah.
Sure. We'll just stay at 1.0
Exactly.
then.
Yeah.
Yep.
What is that version actually referring to there? Since I mean, I know that's not our Ratify version. Is it like a schema version for our config or? Oh, okay.
But are we honoring that version anywhere? I don't know. It's just for future. If we have the official releases, yes, we need to take into consideration the schema changes.
Yep.
Well, I'm confused as well. Is that version right there the version of this particular policy or the schema that underpins it?
Schema is my understanding. Maybe Akash can confirm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the schema currently, but we don't do anything with it.
Okay.
I didn't really know what it was for, so I just left it.
So we have this version per plugin, right? Like, are we having one version for the entire config?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. We can make it plugin specific. So I could.
No, I'm saying, does the config have, would it be beneficial if we have a version at the config level versus having it every section?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, because we do have it in every section. I don't know if it's redundant.
Yeah, something to think about. I don't know what was the reason initial I put that version right now. Yeah, but but anyhow, with any schema version, it's good to have it, although we don't enforce so that in future when we have this streamlined. Okay, but in alpha, I wouldn't worry much. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks for confirming. Yeah, so Akash's PR for the policy provider is ready for review. Teja, when you have a chance,
Yeah, I'll
let us know if you
only
have
on
any.
Fridays, Akash, very crazy with lots of presentations. Yeah.
Cool. Any other comments about this PR before we move on to the next? Okay, the next PR is updating the auras fetch reference workflow.
This one was it's relatively small. The Auras v2 just had another update where they allowed you to fetch the content. So you can fetch blob content without actually first resolving the descriptor. So I just switched over to using that. Just
Is that a
simplifies-
performance improvement?
It normally would be, and it would be for anyone else using V2, but in our case, it actually really isn't. Just the way we the calls are ordered, because we first have to resolve the subject descriptor, because the refers method requires the descriptor. So there's no savings there. And then after we get the use the refers method, have the refers, we then call the get reference manifest for each of those. And we already have the descriptors from the refers method. So we're not actually doing any resolving extra there. And then after we have the manifest, that's when we actually try to download the blobs. And in our case, because we have the manifest, we already have the descriptors, so we don't need to do any extra resolving. But this scenario is if someone tried to use our API independently, where they just wanted to get the blob content and they only had the reference, then you can skip the default, the extra step of resolving for the descriptor first, which is one extra call that is removed. But in our particular flow, we aren't actually really taking advantage of that. But I thought if it's there and it's released, might as well just switch over to it to kind of simplify some of the code. So
Thanks. I'll start reviewing this tomorrow.
okay, thanks.
Next PR, I've merged the certificate utility for loading certificates from a directory this morning. So I've created a separate PR to update our sample configuration map to pass in the directory instead of the specific certificate. And I've updated the key vault configurations with like a second certificate to set it as an example, like how you can configure multiple certs. And I will merge this after we've released 1.3, basically updating our get started section to reference the latest release. Yeah, Akash and Teja, let me know if you have any feedback on this.
Good.
Add comments. Yep. Okay.
Thanks.
I saw a PR for the timeout thing. That's merged, right?
Yes. Go ahead, Akash.
So does that align with whatever you told us, Akash, regarding Kubernetes version and something? Right?
So we had actually the gatekeeper, one of the gatekeeper maintainers from Microsoft, he actually signed off on us increasing the Ratify timeout to 7 seconds. So they,
It's Certak?
yes, Certak. Yep.
Okay.
That's more than doubled.
Yeah, so good. Yeah,
So
they,
that theory is correct then. Whatever theory you told, right? Kubernetes version, that dependency is not there, that hard dependency.
yes, yeah, there's they agree that that's a proper fix for the issue. We did add in the documentation that it requires you run 1.20 and higher in your cluster. At least for the Azure side, that doesn't seem to be a big deal because we're already 1.19 is almost at end of life. But anyways, we added a little note on top saying you have to be running 1.20 for you to override the default from 3 to 7. So
Nice.
Yep.
Nice one, Akash. Good job.
thanks.
Okay, next item on the agenda is we're running through some cosign scenarios where we realize we don't have registry authentication for cosign artifacts. So Akash just listed out what are the blockers to fetch from a private registry. Akash, do you want to talk about it?
Yep. So previously we did support cosign signatures and verifying them, but that was with the assumption that the registry would be like a public registry, so it was just a anonymous pull. But if we want to support like private registries with specific credentials, it's a little bit more challenging, just because of the way cosign is set up. Cosign actually doesn't use OCI artifacts to attach signatures. They bundle their signature as an OCI image and push it to the same repo. So when you list in your repository for images, you'll see your own image and then the signed signature next to it. That kind of makes it a little bit tougher to with actually fetching the signature, which is why Eric had originally created a separate cosign.go class within the ORS implementation to handle when we fetch the refers, to call a separate routine that will use the Google Container Registry to fetch the cosign signatures attached to an image. Because we're using a different client, which is the Google client also now needs credentials somehow to access the private registry. In the case of listing the refers, that's an ORS operation. So ORS has its own auth provider, and we can just leverage that to extract the credentials from the client that we make and then feed that through, pipe that into the cosign subroutine, which will call the Google client and give it the credentials. So that works. Unfortunately, on the verification side, the cosign verifier requires credentials as well, because it handles the pulling of the signature, which right now the cosign verifier is a separate plugin, and that's just how the whole plugin model was designed. So getting it access to credentials that were pulled at the refer store, actually specifically at the ORS store level, is kind of like a breaking the abstraction barriers there. So trying to figure out if we should solve this problem, and if so, how would be the best way to do it, if that kind of makes sense. So
What is the scope for MVP?
I don't know how important it is to have cosign support. I think our main focus has been Notary. So
there's been two main camps. The way that from an outsider looking in, there's two main camps. There's, Sigstore cosign and Gatekeeper and Caverno have, worked with them. And then there's the Ratify solution with Notary, with notation.
Yep.
So up until now, I just assumed that our MVP was a notation-based solution with an ORS registry.
I think that is the MVP still, but I'm not sure what the reasoning exactly was behind, adding cosign support. Maybe it was just to show that it is possible. Teja, maybe you have more context on that.
Yeah, exactly. It's just showing how open-ended is the framework and how you can plug in the other verifiers. It's not just scoped to the Notary verifiers or the very specific efforts that are being made. So it's just a showcasing thing, I would say. I don't know how much is the priority to go in and put extra effort on supporting cosign with private registries. But what you told made sense. Yeah, because they use some tag-based convention, and verifier will again pull that tag and verify it, cosign signatures, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I understand your problem. But why is this on the agenda list? Did we get any ask? Did we get any issue on how to support cosign, private registry, and Ratify?
Teja, we didn't have any customer ask. We were just running through some scenario where we realized that having cosign enabled property set to true, and our executor or like this referrer is trying to pull from ORS, like trying to pull the cosign artifact, which resulted in 401.
Yeah,
But
I
it's
don't
not
know.
an
Maybe
ORIS call, right?
The
I think we use
scenario,
a fallback method, I guess, Jimmy. We
Oh,
try to
okay.
list the referrers from ORAS. ORAS says no, if cosine is enabled, we try cosine
Yeah.
to query for the
Because
cosine.
cosine
significance.
is kind of like it's tag based, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a tag based. It's a tag convention based signatures.
so for now, can we just call out that the cosine path only supports anonymous pool enabled registry, like public registries?
It seems reasonable if it involves this much effort of us, because I would rather focus on the OPA policy engine and how do we enhance our policies for the whatever verifications that we have. That's where I would be interested to focus on.
Yeah.
And
Sounds
So
focus
I'm
more
going
on
to.
the notifier. Go ahead, Jimmy. Sorry.
I was going to say. Well, I was going to say when Ratify calls notation calls. In the case of AWS, there'll be a plugin for Signer. I'm not sure if you all need a plugin as well, but that whole call chain will have a what you guys refer to as a workload identity, but for us it'll be like a service account connected to a principal role. So that's how the credentials will be chained to the entire call to whatever, to let's say ECR inside AWS. So if that chain of credentialing is different from cosine, then I see that as a separate body of work.
Yep.
Am I missing something?
No, you're on the right track. And whatever notary with ECR, I think ECR is following the OCI artifacts path. So whatever we have today, the plumbing should work for ECR. If not, I think that would be a good effort to spend time on. How can we expand this with ECRs, whatever identity management it has?
So
How
I
do we
think
bring that management in? Yeah.
So I think we're going to have an ORIS ready ECR registry in the next several weeks, and then, but I've already used logins for the way that we log in with ECR. I've used that same way to log in with Notation Client and the ORIS client, and it works right now with ECR.
Okay.
So it's just a matter of ECR supporting ORIS. So I think that's the way that I'm going to have to go. If this project does start doing work with cosine, I'm going to have to put that on the back burner. I mean, just for me, because I don't have time to do that and the notation piece.
Yeah, I second you. I think that's the same thing. But the workload identity support, you're saying there is some difference in how it works in AKS and how it works in whatever Kubernetes.
Yeah. So the way that it works inside AWS is that we have a controller running inside the cluster inside EKS. And so what we will do is we will create a role with a set of permissions attached to it via policies. And then that role will be annotated to a service account. And then that service account will be used by the pod. Mm-hmm. And the controller within the cluster will make sure that the permissions are granted to that pod via that service account's annotation for the role. So that's how it works inside EKS.
I see. I think these all items will come up once ECR supports OCI artifacts, right? ORAS and everything. Then,
well, yeah, I mean,
then we figure out the authentication piece in Kubernetes clusters.
Exactly. I think it's going to be very cloud provider specific.
Okay. I think that would be a priority list for us. Once ECR supports ORAS, we will have Ratify support, whatever in Kubernetes.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the idea of how the credential chain gets applied to the pod via quote unquote the workload identity, to me that is, I don't want to say it's completely out of band from what we're doing, but it's implementation specific and not something that I thought we had to worry about.
Okay. Implementation.
So it's cloud provider specific. So I don't, as long as the pod in which Ratify is running, in which also Notation Client is there as well, because Ratify is going to call the Notation Client the way that I understand it. As long as that pod has a service account associated with it such that the containers can use that service account, and that service account has, in the case of AWS, EKS has annotations applied to it that gives it a role principal, which provides the permissions for that specific service account. That's the way that we would do that with any type of workload that needed AWS service access.
Agreed. I think there will not be any changes per se in Ratify, but at least we will have some sample written or sample tested out and documented.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
And that's what I'm planning for. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Jimmy, do you have a timeline when AWS would be support auras?
Let's see, 2030. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry.
2030.
I'm sorry. It was supposed to be in April. I think it's going to be early May. Don't quote me on that. I don't like to give dates because of things, happen. Like I said, the credential chaining, I think logging into it already works. So it's just a matter of getting the ORAS functionality inside ECR. So I think it's going to be in May. And then it's a matter of putting down the example configuration such that, here is how Ratify is configured with notation client. And we also need an AWS signer plugin for the notation client for our last mile piece. And then part of that example will also be, here is the IRSA, and that's IRSA. That's IAM roles for service accounts. That's how we attach an IAM role principal to a service account used by the containers. So that will all be part of the example when we build this whole thing out for the AWS, how it works in AWS.
Yep.
Does that help at all?
Yes. Yeah,
I'll be happy to give a demo and show you what I'm talking about. Even if it's not soup yet, I can show you what I'm talking about.
Oh, would you want to, do you have any private bits to demo or?
No, this would all be public stuff. I mean, IRSA is wide open stuff. So it works in Kubernetes or EKS. It's just a matter of, like I said, annotating a service account. And then we have a controller running that looks for the annotation and grabs the credential chain and applies it to the pod based on, or to the container based on the IRSA.
Okay. When you're ready, feel free to
Yeah.
add it to the agenda, and then we're happy to see the demo.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot more work that I have to do before then. Quite frankly, the IRSA piece is the easy piece. Yeah. The other pieces I discovered today I think are going to be a little more difficult.
Sure. Do you have a question, or you mentioned earlier you spoke to the AWS team.
Are we done with all the actionable and the agenda items, all the PRs?
I see. I have one more, just checking the direction, and then I'll be done. Just quickly,
Absolutely.
I'm working on moving our Helm chart to a separate repository, and I think the idea is on GitHub release, we want to automatically update our Helm chart, so then our Helm chart points at the latest image. I think that's the plan. Does anyone have any feedback on my plan? If not, I'll just continue working on that.
I think it makes sense to me.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Jimmy.
So today, excuse me, I'm sorry. So today in a meeting with the folks that support the AWS signer service, they don't have a lot of Kubernetes knowledge in their side of the house. So I'm kind of like helping there. And they explained to me that the way that they envision this working is that Ratify would call notation, and notation would use an AWS signer plugin that they're working on. And so there's multiple implications for that, right? So for instance, when we install Ratify in Kubernetes cluster or an EKS cluster inside AWS accounts, the image that we have to use will have to have notation installed as well as it will have to have the plugin for notation, the AWS Signer plugin installed. So it's going to be a custom image is what it looks like. And then on top of that, we talked about how do we get the trust stores and trust policies configured for that implementation. And so what I heard earlier on the call tonight was that if you change the trust, I thought I heard this, maybe I'm incorrect, Akash, I thought maybe you said this. If you change the trust store and or trust policy, you've got to bounce Ratify. Is that the case for notation trust stores and trust policies?
So, okay, so I think I might also be, so when you say trust store and trust policy, is the trust store it's ORS, right? So how we pull in our artifacts we call it the refer store. Is that the same?
Okay. I
Yeah.
think
So I
it
think
is.
the trust store is for the notify, the notary
notation
verifier,
client.
Notary verifier. Yep.
Oh, so,
Yeah.
so that's
That
separate.
will be a
then.
config.
That's
on the
separate. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my assumption was I mean, again, they're not Kubernetes folks, and I'm not the most knowledgeable on the Ratify solution. So I just go from a very macro level that Ratify has to use notation in this solution, and notation is for the AWS signature verification is going to use for its last mile a plugin for AWS Signer. That being the case, we need to configure it such that trust stores and trust policies are configured for notation that's going to be used by Ratifier. So it looked like to me there were multiple ways I could do this. One of which was, hey, write a daemon set that had privileges and push out notation client and its plug in to every single node, which I don't want to do. So then the next thing was create an image that had Ratify in it, and then also put in the notation client with the configurations we need for trust store and trust policy, as well as use the plugin for AWS Signer. So my thought was, instead of hard coding everything in there, obviously I want to put the trust store configuration and the trust policy configuration as like a mapped config map item, such that they could be read when the container boots up. So that's what I'm trying to get my head around.
Jimmy, one question over here. So the signing part, the plugin, the AWS plugin for the signing, I think, and the specificality that we are bringing here is the trust store and the trust sources configuration that is used by the AWS plugin, right? So that for doing the verification, correct?
So yeah,
that one, I think that's where if you can pull up the config, yeah, the Notary V2, today it is taking a kind of very simple verification certs that will be replaced by a trust store configuration.
Yes, and a trust policy.
Yep.
And so the way that I understand it was that there's 3 custom things for the EKS solution or AWS solution, and that would be the notation, trust store, and trust policy configurations. And then the third thing is the notation plugin for the AWS Signer, all of which is custom is specific to the AWS implementation. And so I was trying to understand what's the best way to deliver that specificity. Is it going to be taking the image and adding it to the container image for Ratify? Is there a different way to do that? That's where I'm at right now, trying to figure out the
that's where,
details.
Jimmy, I think the confusion is that plugin model is defined by Notary V2, right?
Yes.
It is defined by them. Okay.
Yeah.
So Ratify is actually independent, like Ratify doesn't have that influence on that. So if it is bringing the Notary V2 component for verification, the Notary V2 component has to define how to use that AWS plugin or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so my question for you all is, knowing that Ratify has to, for your solution as well, right? Doesn't it Ratify called Notary V2 notation client?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Where is that notation client located?
Today,
Is
I
it-
think it is
is
an
it part of the
built-in
image?
plugin, right?
Is it
It is-
part? Is it part of the Ratify image itself, or is it on the node, or what? What does this call stack look like for the notation client? Where is it
Go
at?
ahead, Akash. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so for Notary is the only verifier that's like this. We have that actually built in. So
It's a first class verifier. That's what we call as.
First class verifier. Okay.
So that means it is integrated within the source code of Ratify. That means it's built in the image of Ratify.
So it's
And-
built in it. So the CLI itself is part of the image in Ratify.
so we don't use the CLI, we actually use the
Oh, you use a
notation
Notary
builder.
Go client.
Library.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to have to look a little deeper at this then and see what, yeah.
We
Okay.
use the package. So the API should support of how to integrate the third party now, the whatever AWS or those.
I'll have to reach out to my AWS folks and find out if they are familiar with this Notary v2.go and if this makes sense to. I hope that it does. I hope that what I'm hoping is that we could pass in a configuration that here's the trust store, here's the trust policy, and oh, by the way, here's the plugin, and we're off to the races. And I don't have to worry about, because the last thing I want to do is Ratify uses this, Go API for Notary V2, and then we're up until now they're talking about using a CLI, and that just doesn't sound right. It didn't sound right, and that's why I wanted to ask the question tonight.
No, it should work because my understanding is Notary will be supporting these kind of external plugins like to support Key Vault, Azure Key
Yes.
Vault or something.
Yeah.
So it should be, I'm assuming it should be simple.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's where I'm at too. I'm
Okay.
right there with you.
We are on the same page. Yep, that's good.
So I appreciate quite frankly, everybody on the call. I appreciate your patience with me because this is a difficult learning curve for me.
We appreciate your inputs also, Jimmy.
So I'll go back and talk to them about this Notary V2 Go and do some discovery on this myself and understand if maybe this will work. If not, then we may be looking at a completely different image. I hope not. Thank you for the link.
Thanks for asking all the questions, Jimmy.
No, well, I mean, you're being charitable. I'm asking because I'm ignorant. I'm trying to learn. So
We're validating our assumptions.
okay,
And,
well, yeah. Again, you're charitable.
okay, I think that's everything on our agenda. Anyone else have any announcement? Good. Okay. Well, I hope we all get some sun this week. Have a good week, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Teja.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Jimmy.
Everyone.
Bye, Akash.
Bye.